Katerina Yaka watched the German soldiers flee, streaming from the east, that's what she was seeing. Allied bombers flew above them, she thought they all might die, and then soon there was the silence of all the SS men. When the sun rose the next morning, it was the 1st of May, and they all sang the Internationale. They all sang the Internationale. Katerina Yaka saw red flags flapping in the breeze above the Russian tanks, and she fell upon her knees. And so many different voices in so many different tongues sang the most beautiful song that could ever have been sung. In German, Lithuanian, in Polish and in Dutch, a myriad of melodies has never had been such. In Russian and in Yiddish, Italian and French, emerging from the forests beneath the trench. When the sun rose the next morning, it was the 1st of May, and they all sang the Internationale. When the sun rose the next morning, it was the 1st of May, and they all sang the Internationale. They all sang the Internationale. Völker hört die Signale auf zum letzten Gefecht. Die Internationale erkämpft das Menschenrecht. Völker hört die Signale auf zum letzten Gefecht. Die Internationale erkämpft das Menschenrecht.
Hello and welcome to Revolutionary Socialist Review with Chris Driscoll and Rainer Shea. Today is, it's actually March 31st today, but you'll probably be seeing this tomorrow, which will be April Fool's Day, April 1st. Anyway, on with the show. The first item we have up today: Russia, Ukraine, and the law of war, crime of aggression. And this comes to us from Consortuim News. It's by Scott Ritter. We've mentioned Scott in the past. Scott is used to be a U.S. Marine for many years, and after that he worked for a number of years for the United Nations as a nuclear weapons inspector, nuclear and chemical and biological weapons inspector. He was one of the inspectors in Iraq, I believe, prior to the U.S. Invasion and occupation of Iraq, because they had WMDs, weapons of mass destruction, which it turns out they didn't. The UN actually told us beforehand that they didn't, but they used that, they meaning the American imperialists, used that as an excuse to go to war with Iraq. Some crazy shit, but that's pretty much par for the course, because they always lie to us about the reasons for getting into these wars, and they've had many. In fact, I cannot think of another country. I firmly believe that there is not another country in the world that has started so many wars. In fact, I think no other country in the world has started anywhere near the number of wars that the Americans have started, the American imperialists, that is, not us normal American folks who really are not into war that much. Anyway, this article by Scott Ritter, quite extensive. It goes into the law of war and brings it around ultimately, finally, to the war in Ukraine, but it deals with a number of other wars prior to that. As a conclusion, Scott Ritter says, while it might be in vogue for people, organizations, and governments in the West to embrace the knee-jerk conclusion that Russia's military intervention constitutes a wanton violation of the United Nations Charter and, as such, constitutes an illegal war of aggression, the uncomfortable truth is that of all the claims made regarding the legality of preemption under Article 51 of the United Nations Charter, Russia's justification for invading Ukraine is on solid legal ground. So that's what he concludes after taking us through a long journey describing how the law of war, when it comes to actually starting the war, progressed, came about, the uses of it in many different wars, and finally the uses that Russia has under Article 51 that give it solid legal ground for defending itself in Ukraine. That's why I don't even call this an invasion. You know, on American media and European media too, you'll hear constantly that Russia invaded Ukraine. No, Russia is on a rescue mission, rescuing people who are suffering under genocide and ethnic cleansing from the Nazis in the Ukraine government, and in the Ukraine military. So there you have it.
It's like when they claimed that North Korea had violated international law by supposedly invading South Korea. That's what they called it. North Korea's intervention into South Korea, an invasion, when really North Korea had detected that the regime in the South was planning to invade the North. So they always leave out context when talking about these kinds of issues.
Yeah, and of course, the whole thing in South Korea, as it's called, South Korea was deliberately split off from the rest of the country by the American forces during World War II and immediately after World War II. So it was the South Korea was under the invasion and occupation of the United States of America at the time. It was not a legitimate government. Only the North had a legitimate government that was chosen by the people of Korea. So, yeah, it's pretty. When you get down to the truth of these things, it's a lot different than what you hear on American television, American radio, and American newspapers, on American internet news outlets. Anyway, topic number 2, the contradictions within U.S. imperialism that could lead to its final demise.
Now, when it comes to anti-colonialism within the United States, there are two sides to the story, one bleak and one hopeful, as is usually the case with the struggle against oppressors. On the one hand, the indigenous peoples have been wiped out by an overwhelming degree. They're less than 5% of the population, and Black people are still a minority in this country. Whites are still the majority color in this country. But on the other, it's these colonized minorities who have statistically the most potential for serious radicalization, because they're statistically the most oppressed groups. And this has basis in an analysis from a year ago that I read by the sociologist Temitope Oriola, who observed how the Black community in this country, the other colonized peoples in this country as well, who are living under an increasingly deadly militarized police state, who are subject to increasingly severe wanton brutality, who are by the millions living under the carceral state, whether they're locked up or living as second-class citizens, barely even citizens really, under the felon system. These people are experiencing such severe persecution and violence that according to Oriola, at some point they're to take proportionate action and rise up against the settler state. And this, I believe, will be the facet of the class struggle that ignites the broader revolutionary effort. Obviously, the colonial contradiction is not the only contradiction. Obviously, plenty of whites are oppressed by capitalism too. But I believe that the colonial contradiction and the colonized peoples are so important to focus on because they're going to be the catalyst. Their struggle, what's being done to them, is going to be the catalyst for the coming revolution. And what I also want to stress is that these people are not going to start this conflict. They're going to be backed into a corner by the oppressor state. The oppressor state is going to be what starts whatever conflicts emerge in this regard in the coming decades.
Yes, the police and other oppressive forces are always the source of the violence. Always. The demographics of America are pretty interesting, actually. While whites constitute a majority, somewhere around 60% of America, among the working class, it's a little different. Among the working class, oppressed nationalities constitute more than 50% of the working class. Those people, brown and black people, Latin Americans, who are the greatest number, blacks, who are a lot smaller number, but still significant in some areas and some parts of the country. They make up the majority of the working class. So the reason for that is that white people are much more likely to end up in the middle class than in the working class. They're the ones who get the college education. They're the ones whose families own the small businesses and medium-sized businesses. So they end up more in the middle class. The working class is led by Black and brown people, by Latin Americans and Blacks and other people of color. In that, we're in good hands because, as we know, as Marxists, as Marxist-Leninists, it is the working class that is going to lead the revolution, that is going to be in the forefront of the revolution, part of which is going to be in the vanguard of the revolution. So we're in good hands. And as we know from dealing with Black and brown working class people, they tend to be a lot more progressive, a lot more socialist, a lot more communist than the whites do on average. That's not to say that you can't be a communist if you're white. There are many, white communists too, but we look to the Black and brown people for that stupendous leadership. And yes, they will be the first to move into action because they come under doubly and triply the amount of oppression as white people do. If you're a woman and you're Black and you're working class, you're hit three ways. If you're a man, you're working class and you're white, you're hit one way. So the one way is bad enough. You are oppressed, and they do steal from you. They steal the labor right out of your body every day. But with Black and brown people, and especially with women who are Black and brown people and working class, you're hit by a lot of oppression. Anyway, let's see what's next on the agenda. Russian MOD. This comes from the Russian Ministry of Defense. Kiev regime seriously considered using bioweapons against Russia, the Donbass. And this comes to us from Sputnik News. Sputnik News, of course, used to be called Radio Moscow back in the day, but it's Sputnik News now. So the Russian military has spent weeks shedding light on research into deadly pathogens being conducted in Ukrainian laboratories under the direction of the Pentagon and with U.S. funding. Washington initially denied the MOD's reporting as Russian disinformation, but officials and media have since corroborated many of the assertions. It's kind of funny how often the Russian disinformation turns out to be, in fact, the fact. The whole fact and nothing but the facts. Ukrainian authorities seriously considered the possibility of using biological weapons against civilians in the Donbass and Russia, and the military will hold a special briefing on the matter. Russia's Ministry of Defense spokesman Igor Konashenkov has said, the facts which have been unearthed demonstrate that the Kiev regime seriously considered the possibility of using biological weapons against civilians in the Donbass and in Russia. Konashenkov said in a briefing on Wednesday. The spokesman said the Russian military is continuing its analysis of documents received from employees of the Ukraine-based biological laboratories, including the secret military biological activities being conducted in the country by the US. As a result of the analysis of new materials by experts from the Russian radiological, chemical, and biological defense troops, special officials who were involved in the creation of components of biological weapons have been named. These include the heads of departments and employees at the U.S. Department of Defense Department, as well as its main contractor companies. As ongoing journalistic investigations in the Western press show, these campaigns were directly connected to Hunter Biden, the son of the US president. Konashenkov said. The MOD spokesman did not elaborate on when the new information would be made public. The Russian military has spent the past month slowly pulling back the curtain on the extent of US-funded research into dangerous pathogens in Ukraine-based labs. Last week, the MOD cited documents which implicate an investment firm connected to Hunter Biden in the financing of the military biological program in Ukraine.
I couldn't pick up on all that much of it, but I was seeing just now the headlines that the media in the US continues to put forth, claiming that this is pure disinformation. NPR just had a headline claiming that all of this comes from bad government propaganda actors in Russia and the far right. And that's a rhetorical tactic that the media has used for years now when it comes to the propaganda war against Russia. Because when it came to Syria, they were claiming that all of the arguments for false flags being at work against Assad, for the West having had a hand behind the conflict in Syria, involved the far right. And that's a tactic to look out for, because if you were to just get that information from NPR, you would think that the entire basis for the biolab argument originates from the far right and from supposedly completely untrustworthy Russian propaganda actors. But from what I understand, there's actual material basis for this.
Yes. Definitely actual material basis for this. I mean, the Russians have uncovered a lot of information, a lot of it coming to us from employees of these laboratories, who I guess were kind of disgusted by what their employers were doing, and knew that they were violating the international law concerning biological and chemical warfare. So, yeah. Next on the agenda, the U.S. empire is using engineered destabilization to delay its full demise.
I said earlier that when it comes to liberation, there's usually both a bleak story and a hopeful story. And when it comes to the decline of U.S. imperialism, the hopeful story is that the U.S. empire is objectively in rapid decline. U.S. hegemony is shrinking by the year. It's been failing to carry out coups within Kazakhstan and Venezuela and Cuba and so forth. Bolivia has broken free from neocolonialism. Once again, Russia is advancing against the Washington puppet regime in Kiev. The US empire has lost control over Afghanistan, but there is where the bleak side comes in that within many of these countries, probably most of these countries, the US empire is still succeeding in its goal of sowing instability within them. Washington is able to engineer an increasingly awful famine within Afghanistan. Well, it's increasing in the sense that the sanctions are not letting up, and that's bad news. But there's also the hopeful side in Afghanistan in that China is providing aid for Afghanistan, from what I read recently, and the People's Republic of China is aiming to develop Belt and Road Initiative infrastructure within the country as soon as possible. So there are these competing factors of bleakness and hopefulness when it comes to this story, when it comes to the struggle to liberate the world from imperialism. And as much as we'd want to run victory laps, the reality is these countries are not going to be free from imperialism for as long as imperialism is able to kill people within their borders through their economic warfare, their chaotic meddling, their sowing of proxy warfare. And the best that we can do as those in the core of imperialism is advance Marxism-Leninism, advance the struggle to overthrow the U.S. empire from within.
Exactly. Exactly. The U.S. empire certainly has a vast array of ways to engineer destabilization, and we can see it all over the world. Afghanistan's one example that you used. By the way, aid is pouring into Afghanistan from Russia, from China, from Iran, and other countries. So they do have people who care and are helping. It's just not the United States, who the United States, of course, is doing the exact opposite. They destabilized Afghanistan for more than 20 years, and they're still doing it. So next on the list, millions in India joined general strike against the Modi government. And this comes to us from Popular Resistance. Let's see if I can find it here. The strikers' main demands are wide-reaching and include scrapping privatization plans and raising the minimum wage. The strikers are also protesting a new law that would give bosses more power over wages and hours and allow contract work, making the Indian working class even more precarious. Other factors spurring workers to take to the streets include rising fuel prices, in large part a result of the war in Ukraine, and growing poverty. Over 100 billion people are estimated to have fallen into poverty in India in 2020. Strikers are also demanding income support from the government. Millions of workers took to the streets in India today, and this was as of the 28th of March, as part of a 2-day general strike. The strike, which has shut down much of the country, was called in opposition to the government of Narendra Modi. And ultra right wing Hindu nationalists who is currently attempting to privatize many of India's publicly held assets. The strike, which is planned to continue through tomorrow, well, that would be the 29th, so it's over by now, but includes workers at India's publicly held banks, a main target of Modi's privatization, transport workers, the dozens of other workers in both private and public industries. The strike was called by a joint forum that includes 12 of the country's largest trade union federations, including the All India Trade Union Congress, the India National Trade Union Congress, representing various sectors of the coal, steel, transportation, banking, postal, and telecommunications, to name a few. According to the officials of the AITUC, over 2 million workers, both in the formal and informal sectors, are expected to join the strike, or I guess we should say were expected to join the strike. I haven't gotten the figures yet about how many people actually came out, but 200 million were expected, so maybe even more than that. So pretty big deal in India. I mean, God, I don't think America's ever had a strike like that. We've had a couple of major general strikes back in the ancient past, back a century ago, basically, but nothing like this.
Well, India's population is a lot bigger, so that's something to consider.
Three times bigger.
Yeah. Yes. When it comes to India, there once again is both a bleak story and a hopeful story. On the one hand, you have this clearly extremely active labor movement, extraordinarily active. I'll give it that, despite the caveat about the population being so much bigger than most other countries. But on the other, you have this ultra-right government that is functioning, let's face it, with mass backing, because there is a great social base for fascism within India. It's ingrained so deeply into their political structure through the caste system. It's ingrained through Hindu nationalism, which has Hindu nationalism is, from what I understand, the longest running fascist movement in the world. It traces all the way back to the founding of fascism, and it survived World War II. And it's seemingly more powerful than ever. So we're going to have to see, when it comes to India, whether revolution or fascism triumphs. Because there's a quote, I don't know who said it, but it's behind every fascist regime is a failed revolution. That quote haunts me.
Yes, it's very true. And there is a big fascist and a big ultra-right nationalist movement in India, enough to elect the president, Prime Minister Modi. It hasn't always been that way. You know, Modi's having his day now, and we'll see in the future. But I think that a lot of the very unpopular neoliberal aspects of the Modi government are going to end up being what brings it down in the end. Whether India's ripe for revolution anytime soon, I don't really think so, despite the fact that there are states in India with communist governments. And there are states that are under communist insurgencies. So it's a very mixed bag. India is very large. It's got a lot of sectors that are very different. It's got a lot of sections of the country that are very different. So, yeah, we'll see. I have a very good friend who's Indian, and he keeps me well apprised of the politics there. But as you know, 250 million farmers protested in India last year, and now we're getting 200 million workers protesting. So, there's a very, the other thing to know about India is that the working class is rather small. It doesn't have it's still primarily a peasant economy. So, I think I don't know exactly how large the working class is. It's certainly larger than it was 50 or 75 years ago. But, I think 200 million people, that's pretty close to being the size of the working class in India. And when you put that up against there being 1.1 billion people, that's less than 20%. So, anyway, any revolution that takes place in India will by necessity rely heavily on the farming class, on the peasantry, as well as the working class. Next on the list, let's see where we're at here. Vampires in the war, U.S. warmongers feeding on the bloody turbulence in other countries. Are you still with us?
Oh, yes.
Oh, wait. Oh, that's mine. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. For some reason, I thought that's the one that I'm supposed to do. Let me get it straight here. I'm not really being on the ball at the moment. Okay. Vampires in the war, U.S. warmongers feeding on the bloody turbulence in other countries. The Democratic and Republican parties in the U.S. are generally divided on many topics, from climate change to same-sex marriage. But there is one exception, the defense expenditure. In 2020, the U.S. spent nearly $780 billion on its military. The figure was more than the total expenditure of the other 9 countries following the U.S. that spent the most on military in the same year combined. To justify such a large military expenditure, the U.S. had tried to incite wars around the world, with Russia-Ukraine conflict their latest target. John Mersheimer, a prominent American international relations scholar, reiterated in a recent opinion piece published in The Economist on March 19th that the West, and especially America, is principally responsible for the Ukraine crisis. Since 2008, the U.S. has been encouraging Ukraine to join the EU and NATO, leading to the Russian-Ukraine conflict escalating into a war, he said. After the Russia-Ukraine war broke out, students at the University of Chicago, where Mersheimer works, circulated a letter calling for the cancellation of John Mersheimer over Putinism. However, what the students do not know is that the U.S. military-industrial complex is moving full steam ahead regarding the Russian-Ukraine war, which some media outlets have called the biggest land conflict in Europe since World War II. The MIC, military-industrial complex, that is a unique phenomena in the United States. During World War II, the 5 top U.S. defense contractors, Lockheed Martin Corporation, Raytheon Company, Northrop Grumman Corporation, the Boeing Company, and General Dynamics Corporation, made a large profit from the war and got a large number of federal government contracts during that period. Since then, their interests have been bound together. During the Cold War era, the U.S. military defense contractors, the federal government, the Congress, and local universities cooperated closely and extended their forces to new industries like aerospace, energy, the electronics industry, information technology, and bioengineering, creating an enormous MIC. Think tanks and the media have all been dragged into it, and they become part of the complex of shared interests. The MIC has hogged most of the US wealth and become a monster that the country cannot get rid of. On January 17th, 1961, in his farewell address, then President Dwight Eisenhower warned against the establishment of a military-industrial complex, noting that the potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power along with the MIC existed and would persist. The MIC also has a great influence on US presidential elections, as about 30% of the US companies and 1/4 of the country's employment opportunities are related to the MIC. In addition, some of the US states where these military contractors have established their bases of operation, like Michigan, Ohio, and Florida, are also swing states that no presidential candidate would want to lose. The Russia-Ukraine conflict is a major boon for the world's largest defense contractors, such as Raytheon, which makes the Stinger missile, and jointly, along with Lockheed Martin, makes the Javelin anti-tank missiles being supplied to Ukraine by the likes of the US and Estonia. Lockheed's shares are up by around 16%, and Raytheon around 3% since the military conflict in Ukraine began. The independent media outlet The Conversation reported on March 9th. Indeed, sanctions imposed by the US and European governments in conjunction with some multinational companies have hit Russian economy hard. On March 14th, 850 stores belonging to McDonald's in Russia were officially closed. Also, at least 300 multinationals have pulled out of Russia since the conflict began. But the crisis in Ukraine will benefit the US economy and multinationals in the long run, observers noted. Companies with European countries such as Germany and France have invested much more in Russia than in the United States. In the future, these companies will likely have to turn to the US for alternative investment destinations.
This pertains to that article of mine you were about to touch on, which is the U.S. empire will be able to do less damage the better the communist movement is at combating and defeating the empire. That's basically what its headline is. And this really showcases what you just said, why that's the case, why the empire's ongoing existence is such an imminent threat to the human race. Because even if World War III is not started, even if the US empire doesn't drop the atomic bomb or something crazy, wild like that in the coming decades, the reality is that untold millions of people around the world, both within and without the US empire's borders, are suffering and in danger of dying. And I think that's something that we relatively privileged people in the core of the empire need to always recognize, because you can invoke apocalyptic scenarios like a third world war to get people motivated for mobilizing against imperialism, but it should be enough that imperialism is currently threatening millions of lives right now, subjecting probably hundreds of millions of people in total, maybe even billions, to lives that they do not deserve to live. Billions of people would be liberated from economic strangulation in various forms if imperialism were to be defeated. And that's good enough of a reason to do everything in our power to defeat the empire.
Right. Okay, next on the list, the sooner U.S. imperialism gets totally defeated, the less harm it can do to its in its decline.
There's where the apocalyptic scenarios come in, because they're something to take seriously as well. When you look at World War II, you see just how much damage an empire, especially a modern empire, can do in its decline. In reaction to the decline that the German Empire endured during the early 20th century, an ultra-right party took power and ultimately killed something like probably 11 million, 10 or 11 million were killed in the Holocaust alone, and tens of millions more were killed in World War II. So that's the consequence of not being able to snuff out an empire during its decline. Just because an empire is weakened doesn't mean it's not capable of mobilizing towards vast, drastic actions. The equivalent was the case for the Japanese Empire, which perpetrated multiple genocides during the years leading up to its relative collapse. And the difference now, the hopeful aspect, is that unlike the German or Japanese empires, the US empire is not going to be able to really recover following its collapse, following that point of reaction and accelerating demise and defeat. Germany and Japan were able to build up more imperialist capital following World War II. They were able to largely shield themselves and their guilty leaders from justice despite the Nuremberg trials. But it's more likely that after the US empire falls, it's not going to be able to escape those consequences. Its final judgment day is going to come.
Finally, on the list tonight is a Margaret Flower's interview with Michael Hudson. I'm not going to spend too much time on this one, other than to say that this is part of the internet radio show called Clearing the Fog, which is done weekly, I believe, by Popular Resistance, and Margaret is the executive director of Popular Resistance. Of course, Michael Hudson is the premier Marxist economist in the United States. And he's talking on the issue of the US dollar hegemony ended abruptly last Wednesday. And this interview came from March 28th, 2022. So last Wednesday was more than a week ago now. It just says on Wednesday, March 23rd, 2022, the United States announced that it would freeze Russia's access to its gold. Russia has the 5th highest amount of gold in the world. Economist Michael Hudson explains that this action, which follows the U.S. seizing of Venezuela and Afghanistan's gold and assets, has effectively ended dollar hegemony, which has been in decline in recent years, and the free ride that the U.S. has enjoyed abroad. Hudson states that we are now in uncharted territory, as nothing like this has occurred in modern history. Sanctions on Russia are driving a shortage of fertilizer, which will lower food production and bring famine. Hudson predicts greater inflation, particularly for food and fuel, and shortages, which are all good for Wall Street profits, and more businesses being forced to close. So that's the short description of this video. We'll have the video up for you as a link under this video show, so you can check it out for yourself, along with all the other great articles that we have surveyed this week in Revolutionary Socialist Review. So with that, we've come to an end. I want to thank Rainer, first of all, for the great work you always do. Thank you to everyone who tuned in, to all of our viewers. And I hope you will tune in again next week when we will have another episode of Revolutionary Socialist Review. Until then, I bid you a sweet adieu.